Think about this for a moment. Right now, nestled in a drawer or tucked inside your jacket, you likely possess a small navy blue booklet stamped with a gold eagle. Without it, you cannot board an international flight, step across a national border, or prove to the global order that you have a legal right to exist outside your home country. You take this document for granted as a fundamental, immutable fact of modern life. But for the first 165 years of American history, that document was completely unnecessary. From the founding of the Republic in 1776 all the way to the eve of Pearl Harbor in late 1941, an American citizen could walk down to the docks of New York, Boston, or San Francisco, buy a ticket, and step onto an ocean liner bound for Europe, Asia, or South America without showing a single piece of government-issued identification. There were no border checkpoints requiring papers. There were no federal photo IDs. There were no passport applications, no administrative fees, and no state agency deciding whether you were permitted to leave the country. You simply packed a trunk, crossed an ocean, and walked off the ship onto foreign soil. If you wanted to travel the world, you just went. The world before World War II was an unmapped frontier of absolute movement. International borders were lines on paper, not security checkpoints lined with biometric scanners and federal agents. For generations, tens of millions of people moved back and forth across the Atlantic, built businesses across continents, and established lives under foreign skies without ever asking their government for permission to leave and without proving who they were when they arrived. So how did the United States function for over a century and a half without controlling who came and went? How did a nation founded on individual liberty manage to fight major wars, build an industrial empire, and welcome waves of global migration without ever requiring its citizens to carry papers? The answer is a story of a system that was never supposed to exist. It is the story of a temporary emergency measure enacted during a moment of existential crisis that was quietly engineered into a permanent infrastructure of state surveillance. What began as a short-lived 4-year security precaution during the darkest days of the Second World War became an inescapable, multi-billion-dollar fixture of American authority that no citizen ever voted for, no Congress ever debated making permanent, and no presidential administration ever gave back. To understand how a free society was persuaded to trade the right of unrestricted travel for a government-issued permit, we have to go back to the summer of 1914, when the old world collapsed into war and the first cracks appeared in the architecture of global movement. The unmapped frontier of global movement did not collapse because of a sudden realization that state-issued identity documents were necessary for human society. It collapsed because of a single summer, a spark in Sarajevo, and the sudden, terrifying realization that modern industrial warfare could not tolerate uncontrolled populations. When the guns of August 1914 began to fire across Western Europe, the centuries-old open borders of the continent vanished almost overnight. Imperial governments realized with blinding clarity that open, unmonitored borders were a catastrophic military liability. Spies, saboteurs, draft dodgers, and enemy combatants could slip across frontiers under the guise of ordinary travelers, tourists, or merchants. Within weeks, the warring nations of Europe slammed their gates shut. Passports, which had fallen into near-total obsolescence across the Western world during the 19th century, were hastily revived as emergency wartime defensive measures. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched the European continent descend into paranoid isolation, but America was not at war. For 3 years, while European empires demanded papers, police checks, and visas at every rail station, American citizens continued to sail across the Atlantic with complete administrative freedom. They possessed no national identity documents. They carried no federal booklets. The United States government had no systematic mechanism to prevent an American citizen from leaving the country, nor did it track where they went or when they returned. That absolute freedom ended in April 1917, when the United States officially entered the First World War. Almost immediately, federal authorities faced a logistical nightmare. German agents were suspected of plotting sabotage against American munitions plants. Draft resistance was rising, and the federal government realized it had no administrative infrastructure to control who entered or left the nation's ports. On May 22, 1918, Congress passed the Wartime Passport Act, granting the president the extraordinary power to require passports for all international travel during times of war. President Woodrow Wilson quickly issued an executive order enforcing the mandate. For the first time in American history, an American citizen could be arrested simply for trying to leave their own country without a government-issued piece of paper. The public accepted this sudden contraction of liberty because they were told it was a temporary sacrifice. The nation was engaged in a global crusade to make the world safe for democracy. Security measures were framed as emergency war tools, no different from the rationing of sugar or the government takeover of the railroads. When the war ended, the restrictions would vanish, and the old freedom of movement would return. And remarkably, after World War I, that promise was actually kept. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed and the emergency powers dissolved, the legal justification for mandatory travel documents collapsed. Congress allowed the wartime passport measures to expire, and in 1921 the mandatory requirement was officially repealed. Once again, an American citizen could buy a steamship ticket and sail abroad without asking the Department of State for permission. Remember this year, 1921. Hold that date in your mind, because it is the crucial piece of evidence that destroys the modern official narrative. The repeal of the 1918 Passport Act proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the United States government understood a fundamental constitutional truth. Wartime identity requirements were temporary emergency exceptions, not permanent powers of the state. For 20 years, the nation returned to normal. Throughout the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, millions of Americans traveled the globe without a passport. The booklet remained an obscure, optional document used primarily by diplomats or travelers visiting specific foreign autocracies that demanded them. The Department of State operated a modest, sleepy passport office that handled a trickle of voluntary applications. But as the 1930s drew to a close, a new and far darker storm was gathering across the Atlantic and Pacific. Nazi Germany was absorbing its neighbors, Imperial Japan was carving up China, and the international order was crumbling once again. In Washington, a small group of unelected bureaucrats in the State Department began looking back at the 1918 playbook. They saw that the old mechanisms of state control would soon be required again. Except this time, the lesson they drew from 1918 was not that emergency measures should end when the war was over. The lesson they drew was that an emergency could be leveraged to build an infrastructure of permanent authority. If only they could design a system that the public would never think to challenge. The government was powerless to stop the coming global war. And into that administrative vacuum stepped an unelected bureaucrat whose name history has largely forgotten, but whose handiwork sits in your pocket today. As the nation stood on the precipice of global war in 1941, the federal government possessed no permanent mechanism to prevent its citizens from leaving its shores. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew that the existing administrative state was entirely unequipped to manage the vast human currents about to be unleashed by global conflict. But Roosevelt was not working in a vacuum. He relied on a career diplomat who had spent nearly 8 years meticulously reorganizing the Department of State into an engine of administrative control. That man was Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Cordell Hull was not a soldier, and he was not an intelligence officer. He was a quiet, obsessive former Tennessee judge with a legalistic mind and an unyielding passion for institutional organization. Hull was a master of administrative architecture, a man who understood that true power in the 20th century did not belong to the generals on the battlefield, but to the bureaucrats who designed the forms, established the registries, and controlled the paper trails. Long before he turned his attention to foreign travel, Hull had already engineered one of the most transformative mechanisms of state power in American history. In 1913, as a young congressman, Hull had personally drafted the federal income tax legislation following the passage of the 16th Amendment. He had constructed a system that began as a modest, targeted levy on the wealthiest 1% of the population, framing it as an equitable measure that would never touch the average working American. Hull understood the profound art of administrative patience. He knew how to build a mechanism that appeared limited, temporary, and benign at its inception, knowing full well that once the plumbing was installed inside the federal machinery, it could be expanded infinitely whenever the state required it. By the autumn of 1941, as Secretary of State, Cordell Hull saw a national emergency once again breaking over the horizon. Axis forces were sweeping across Europe and Asia. Intelligence reports warned of foreign subversion, and the United States was rapidly transforming into the arsenal of democracy. Hull recognized that in an era of industrial total war, an open border was an unthinkable administrative vulnerability. He needed a way to monitor every individual entering and leaving the United States, to catalogue every traveler, and to give the executive branch absolute veto power over human movement across the oceans. To achieve this, Hull and his lieutenants in the State Department looked back at the wartime measures of 1918. They did not see the 1921 repeal of the Wartime Passport Act as a constitutional boundary that had to be respected. Instead, they viewed it as a temporary retreat, an inconvenient mistake made by an earlier administration that had failed to realize the true power of administrative tracking. Hull knew that if he asked Congress for a permanent passport law in a time of peace, it would trigger a ferocious constitutional debate over the fundamental right of free movement. Libertarians, civil rights advocates, and constitutional scholars would argue that a government possessing the authority to grant or deny permission to leave the country was a government that had transformed its citizens into subjects. So Cordell Hull did not go to Congress for a debate. He went to the White House with an executive solution. On November 25, 1941, just 12 days before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8820, which was reinforced by formal Department of State regulations and subsequent presidential directives, including Executive Order 3381 and Executive Order 8820, establishing mandatory passport controls. Under these regulations, drafted under Hull's supervision, no United States citizen could depart from or enter the country without a valid passport issued directly by the Department of State. Think about what this meant. With the stroke of a pen, the fundamental right to cross an ocean without government interference was transformed overnight into a revocable privilege granted by a federal agency. The rationale presented to the public was impeccably reasonable. The nation was on the brink of survival. Saboteurs were active, war was imminent, and national security required absolute authority over the nation's borders. The requirement was explicitly presented as an extraordinary, short-lived response to a temporary global war. Millions of Americans were entering uniform, industries were being converted for military production, and rationing was taking hold across everyday life. In the grand scheme of a total mobilization effort, showing a passport to leave the country seemed like a trivial sacrifice. The historian Martin Lloyd, whose exhaustive research into the legal history of international passports remains a definitive authority on the subject, documented how modern passport systems were repeatedly birthed in moments of martial paranoia, framing temporary military necessities as permanent tools of governance. The public accepted the requirement because they believed the war was a temporary disruption. They assumed that once the Axis powers were defeated and peace was restored, the emergency measures would expire just as they had after the First World War in 1921. They were wrong. Inside the quiet marble corridors of the Department of State, Cordell Hull and his administrative deputies were not building a temporary toll booth for the duration of the war. They were constructing the foundation of a modern bureaucratic empire. Beneath the surface of wartime rhetoric, the State Department began expanding its consular offices, hiring hundreds of clerks, creating vast cross-indexed file registries of citizens, and establishing a lucrative, self-sustaining stream of processing fees that would build an untouchable administrative complex. Stop and look at the shape of this thing. The government had discovered that once you convince a population to accept an identity document in the name of security, you never have to give that power back. All you need is another emergency to justify keeping it. Sociologists and historians of public policy highlight that the establishment of centralized bureaucratic systems was often birthed out of a desire to manage urban chaos and industrial complexity. As populations expanded, administrative state institutions sought standardized metrics to organize modern society. While these mechanisms inevitably created oppressive tools of social control and inequality, their original architects frequently defended them as essential advancements in administrative efficiency and public order. The surrender of freedom is almost never executed in a single dramatic stroke of tyranny. It is accomplished through the quiet, incremental expansion of administrative routine. When President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8820 in late November 1941, the world was on fire, and the requirement for a valid passport was understood as a temporary wartime necessity. The public believed that once the threat was neutralized, the ancient right of unrestricted departure would naturally be restored. They did not realize that the machinery had been built to be permanent. As the war drew to a close in the summer of 1945, the vast military apparatus assembled to defeat the Axis powers began to dismantle itself. Factories stopped producing munitions, millions of soldiers were demobilized, and wartime price controls were slowly lifted. But inside the Department of State, there was no plan to dissolve the passport office. The administrative apparatus that Cordell Hull had spent 8 years expanding had become a permanent organ of state authority. Now, here is where the story takes its sharpest turn. When the Second World War ended, the legal foundation for the wartime passport mandate technically dissolved. But instead of repealing the requirement as Congress had done in 1921, the federal government simply replaced the threat of Nazi Germany with the threat of Soviet Russia. The dawn of the Cold War provided the perfect, unending justification to keep the wartime emergency infrastructure alive indefinitely. In 1952, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act, quietly codifying the emergency passport requirement into permanent federal statute. Under Section 215 of the Act, the President was granted the standing authority to restrict citizen travel whenever a national emergency was declared. And because the United States maintained a state of perpetual national emergency throughout the Cold War, the passport requirement never lapsed. What had been introduced as a 4-year emergency security measure during a global conflict became a permanent fixture of American life without any public debate, any congressional vote on its permanence, or any sunset clause. Consider the sheer scale of this administrative transformation. There was no grand constitutional convention where the American people voted to surrender their right of free movement. There was no intense national dialogue about whether the federal government should possess the absolute power to dictate which citizens could leave the country. The power was simply assumed, institutionalized, and normalized through the quiet mechanics of bureaucratic momentum. The State Department began using the passport not merely as an identity document, but as a political weapon. During the Red Scare of the 1950s, the Secretary of State began denying passports to political dissidents, peace activists, and suspected communists, effectively trapping them within the borders of the United States. Prominent figures like the world-renowned singer and activist Paul Robeson and the celebrated physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer found their passports revoked or denied. The government argued that traveling abroad was not a right, but a revocable privilege, and that leaving the country without executive permission was an act of subversion. Hold that detail in your mind because it exposes the ultimate reality of the system. The power to require a passport is, at its core, the power to prevent a citizen from leaving. It is the assertion that the state owns your body and controls your movement across the earth. When civil rights activists challenged these denials in court, the legal battles reached the Supreme Court in the landmark 1958 case, Kent versus Dulles. The court ruled that the right to travel was a part of the liberty guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment, stating that a citizen cannot be deprived of that liberty without due process. But while the court limited the government's ability to deny passports based on political beliefs, it left the fundamental architecture of the passport mandate entirely intact. The state could no longer easily deny you a passport because of your political views, but you were still legally required to ask for one, pay for one, and carry one if you wished to cross the border. The stealth implementation of the passport system relied on a psychological mechanism that repeats across every major expansion of state power. Once an administrative requirement becomes familiar, the public forgets that it was ever optional. Within a single generation, the memory of an America where citizens could freely board a ship and cross an ocean without government papers was completely erased from the collective consciousness. The public began to view the passport not as an arbitrary restriction on their fundamental liberty, but as a natural, obvious feature of civilized society. They began to believe the myth that passports had always existed, that borders had always been guarded by paperwork, and that a government which cannot track its citizens' movements is a government in chaos. The bureaucratic machinery grew at an astonishing pace. What was once a small, sleepy desk inside the State Department handling a few thousand voluntary applications a year transformed into a massive national bureau. Processing centers were constructed across the country, millions of citizen files were cross-indexed and stored in federal databases, and an endless stream of revenue began flowing directly into the administrative state. The system was in place. The public never saw it happen, and it would never be removed. This investigation connects directly to the broader architecture of control we unravel across secret state files, where isolated historical decisions aggregate into the modern system governing our daily lives. The systematic expansion of state authority never halts at the edge of the sea. Once a government establishes the power to grant or withhold permission to leave a country, that administrative infrastructure inevitably turns inward, expanding until it governs every domestic movement. The permanent mandate established in 1941 was only the initial phase. Over the decades that followed, the simple navy blue travel booklet evolved from a wartime security measure into the anchor of a vast interconnected surveillance apparatus. In 1941, the passport was a physical paper booklet containing a single black and white photograph and a hand-stamped seal. Today, it is a sophisticated tracking device embedded with a digital microchip, storing biometric facial scans, digital signatures, and encrypted personal data linked directly to global law enforcement databases. Consider how the scope of this system has metastasized. What began as a temporary measure affecting a small fraction of wealthy international travelers in 1941 has grown into a massive administrative engine. Today, approximately 160 million Americans, roughly 48% of the total population, hold active United States passports. To obtain this document, citizens pay a standard application fee of over $130, transforming a basic constitutional right into a self-sustaining revenue engine that generates over $2 billion annually for the Department of State bureaucracy. The state did not merely monetize human movement, it used the passport as the blueprint for domestic control. This brings us to the ultimate expansion of the infrastructure, the Real ID Act of 2005. Passed by Congress in the immediate wake of September 11 under the familiar banner of national security, the Real ID Act systematically extended federal identity document requirements to internal domestic travel. For the first time in American history, federal standards were imposed on state-issued driver's licenses, turning local driving permits into national identification cards. Now watch how the timeline converges on our immediate present. After 2 decades of rolling delays, extensions, and public resistance, the federal government set the final enforcement deadline for Real ID in May 2025. Today, an American citizen can no longer step onto a commercial airplane to fly from New York to Los Angeles without presenting a federally approved standardized identification card containing machine-readable facial recognition data. Sit with that progression for a moment. First, they required papers to leave the country. Now they require papers to fly within it. The pattern is undeniable. It is documented that the federal income tax was introduced in 1913 as a temporary, targeted levy on the richest 1%, only to expand into a permanent tax on every working American. It is documented that the Social Security number was introduced in 1936, with explicit legal guarantees that it would never be used for universal identification, only to become the default federal identity tracking number for every citizen from birth. It is documented that the Federal Reserve was sold to the public as a decentralized regional system to prevent financial panics, while functioning as a centralized money-printing monopoly. The playbook never changes. A crisis occurs. An unelected architect presents the administrative solution, framed as a temporary emergency measure. The public accepts the restriction in the name of safety. The emergency ends, but the administrative system remains. The temporary power becomes a permanent fixture, and the public slowly forgets that any other way of living ever existed. The passport is the purest, most undeniable version of this pattern in American history. The government itself proved that mandatory passports were unnecessary by repealing the 1918 wartime restrictions in 1921. But when they reinstated those exact same controls in 1941, they simply chose never to let them go. The temporary emergency of 1941 is now 85 years old and counting. What remains debated by legal scholars is not whether this system expanded, but whether the founders of the American Republic ever intended for the executive branch to possess the power to lock its citizens inside their own borders. The evidence suggests they never contemplated such a mechanism. The absolute right to leave a nation was considered an inherent human liberty, a right that existed long before the modern nation-state and long before the invention of the photo ID. Yet today that liberty exists only on paper, subject to the administrative approval of a federal bureaucrat holding a rubber stamp. That standard navy blue passport sitting in your drawer was never meant to be a permanent reality of your life. It is not an ancient artifact of human civilization, nor is it a foundational element of American liberty. It is the surviving relic of a temporary emergency security measure that was quietly, deliberately converted into an inescapable instrument of domestic authority. Return to that image of the small booklet stamped with the gold eagle. When you pull it out today, you look at a key to the world, a symbol of citizenship that guarantees your return home. But if you look past the gilded emblem and the guilloche background patterns, you see something entirely different. You see a government permit. You see a document that asserts the state's absolute authority to grant or withhold your physical liberty to leave the land of your birth. For 165 years, the United States built an industrial superpower, fought brutal wars, and welcomed tens of millions of human beings across its borders without ever requiring a single American citizen to hold a federal passport to travel the globe. Today, that world of unrestricted movement feels like an impossible fable. We have been conditioned to believe that a society without papers is a society in total breakdown. We have been taught to view the administrative state's permission slip as a natural, self-evident truth of human existence. I want to be very precise here because this is exactly the kind of story where historic nuance gets lost under popular myth. Passports did exist in the 19th century, but they were optional documents, diplomatic courtesies used primarily by elites traveling to autocratic empires like Imperial Russia or the Ottoman Empire. For the average citizen, they were entirely irrelevant. The fundamental right to pack a bag, step onto a ship, and sail to another continent was considered an intrinsic human freedom that no domestic bureaucrat had the right to regulate. Now, as you look at that passport in your drawer, ask yourself a question. If a government can require you to obtain its permission to leave the country, who actually owns your physical movement? The answer to that question reveals a repeating pattern that runs through nearly every modern institution we take for granted. The temporary emergency that never ends. The crisis measure that becomes a permanent infrastructure of surveillance. The administrative expansion that quiet bureaucrats install while the public is looking at the fire. Now that you know who constructed this machinery, and now that you see how a 4-year wartime precaution was quietly transformed into an 85-year surveillance system, ask yourself one last thing. Do you still view that blue booklet as a symbol of your freedom, or do you see it as the gilded key to an invisible cage? What remains open to debate among constitutional historians is whether a free society can ever truly reclaim a right once it has been transformed into a government permit. What is not in dispute is that the expansion of administrative authority never stops on its own. If you want to understand the hidden machinery that built the world you live inside today, subscribe to Secret State Files. Join a community of viewers who look past the official history and examine the documented mechanisms of power, money, and control. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe a government should ever have the power to stop its own citizens from leaving? In our next investigation, we will uncover the secret meeting at Jekyll Island that quietly rewrote the financial rules of the modern world.